So I'm Megan Capone. I'm the archivist for reference and outreach at the City of Boston Archives. I've only had that position since January of this year, but I've been at the archives for 5 years. In 2019, I was hired on as the assistant archivist. And in that role, I did a lot of everything. So I assisted, we have 5 people in the office. There's the city archivist, our archivist for records management, collections management, reference and outreach, and the assistant archivist. So for the first about 4 years, I kind of helped everybody. I did reference requests, I did processing, and rehousing, and kind of wore lots of hats. And now as the reference and outreach archivist, I focus more on that side of things, where I manage all of the reference activities at the archives, making sure that our policies are enforced, and I trained our new staff that came in the collections that we have and the policies that we do, answering requests and overseeing appointments. And I do outreach activities like this, like coming to local places and talking to people. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, because I'm sure some of the questions that you have I'll probably answer in my presentation. So yeah, first I just wanted to say thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about the records that we have, specifically for genealogy research and how we can help. So first, I'm going to talk about what the archives is and what we do. So we are the repository for all records created by the City of Boston government that have to be kept permanently. Different department records and types of records have different retention schedules, and a lot of that is dictated by the state of Massachusetts as to what types of records have to be kept and for how long. And then our mission officially is to ensure the comprehensive and systematic management, preservation, and accessibility of Boston's municipal government records. To do that, we liaison with and help city departments determine what records have to be kept for both legal and historical purposes. We help facilitate the transfer of records when they've reached the end of their retention and they have to come to the archives. We help different departments get records here. Our records manager and collections manager often will go out to other departments and assess what they have from time to time, and either bring stuff to the archives or complete destruction requests with the state. Also, on the storage side and access side of our mission is we store all the records in archival materials, which is acid-free folders and boxes, in a secure, climate-controlled location, and we provide access to researchers. Like I said before, all the records that we have are public records, so we are mandated to make them accessible. And you can see in this picture here, we recently had members of the Trustees Waterfront Ambassadors Youth Group over the summer come in and look at a lot of our records. They were particularly interested in the history of the Harbor Islands and environmental justice. So I pulled a lot of maps of the islands and some institutional records from the Long Island Hospital and the House of Corrections and Deer Island, which are some of the institutions that were out on Deer Island and Long Island. And they spent several hours. And we get a lot of groups like that, and a lot of researchers. Our last fiscal year, we averaged about 200 reference interactions each month. So for a small staff of 5 people, that's quite a lot to do. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our history. So the City of Boston was founded in 1630, but we weren't founded until almost 400 years later in 1988. Prior to that, archival city records were just housed in various departments. Some were in the basement of City Hall, some were still in the offices, and in offices located in other buildings throughout the city. And so there was a federally funded study to assess the state of the records, and they were found to be in a pretty precarious state because they were stored just in random places with no kind of concern for climate control and how stable they were and the state of them. So their legislation was passed to remedy the issue, and as a result, the Archives and Records Division was created within the city clerk's office. So according to the city charter, the clerk's office is charged with maintaining all the records from city council, and because of that, we were added into their office. So by 1989, the city had hired an archives staff and began using a closed public school, the Hemingway School, which you can see pictured here, which is in Hyde Park, as an interim facility. And it was only meant to be an interim facility, but we were actually there until 2007. And it was better than things just being stored kind of randomly, but still not the most ideal conditions for the records. And in 2007, the city decided to reopen that school, and for not as the Hemingway, but as a different school. So they moved us, and they created the Archival Center in West Roxbury, which is where we are today. We share the first floor of this building with the archaeology department. The Boston Public Library has offsite storage here as well. And what was the Boston Planning and Development Agency, but is now just the planning department, also has storage in this building. And it has a spacious reading room. We have climate-controlled stacks. And yes, and a secure environment for the records. And we also have, like I said, a spacious reading room for people to come in and do research. So now, I'm going to move on and talk about the specific records that we have that can help with genealogy research. We have, or just some of the records first. We have a large collection of records from all different kinds of city departments, and that includes city council proceedings dating all the way back to 1822 to the present. We have building plans, mayoral papers from almost every mayor the city's ever had, tax records that also date back all the way to 1822, student records, school committee minutes, different departmental records, including the Landmarks Commission, the Public Works Department, the Licensing Board, the Legal Department, any kind of city department you can think of, we have those records. And some of them are stored off-site, some of them are stored on-site. We have over 20,000 linear feet of records. And then we also have over, I think it's 2 or 4 terabytes of digital records as well that have been transferred over in the last 10 or so years. So moving on to specifically records for genealogy research, because that's why I'm here. The largest collection and what I think are the most helpful for genealogy are the tax records. We have 2,950 linear feet of volumes of tax records, which I don't know if you can visualize linear feet. These shelves are probably 15 feet high, and we have 5 rows of them that are just these records. So we have 3 different kinds of tax records: real estate valuation, personal estate valuation, and poll taxes. And what the records record, it depends on the year and the time period. Earlier records are a lot more detailed because of the poll taxes. And these are not the kind of poll taxes you think of in relation to the civil rights era. These are just these are just taxes that were assessed on adult men living in the city. And they were assessed from 1822 until 1917. Officially, they went later, but they tend to drop off in the records about 1917. And these included names, ages, residences, and occupations of all men living in the city. So they are a really great way to kind of track a person's or your ancestors' residence from year to year, since we have these records for every single year. And a lot of the time, if the residence changed, there'll be a record of that too, where it'll say residence as of May of that year. So you can see if it's different, and then you can follow it from year to year and track this person's residence all the way through, which I find really, really cool. So here is a bigger example of these records. This is a volume from 1900. And you can see as you go across all of the information that it includes. So like I said, it's got names, ages, residence, occupations. You have what the property was used for, whether it was a store or a business or a boarding house, for example, what it was assessed at and what the assessed taxes are. And it's just like I said, it's just a really rich resource for this kind of history that you can track. And since we have so many volumes, you can go year by year all the way through. We have these records up until 1974. The earlier records are a lot more detailed. They're organized this way, where you have it by ward and street address, and they include all this personal information up into about 1953. For some reason, after that point, they changed how they're organized. It's still by ward, but it's by person's name instead of address. So you kind of have to know where someone lived in order to find them that way. And they also drop off, the detail drops off. It includes just the tax information and doesn't really have all of the detailed personal information, which is kind of a shame, and I'm not really sure why they changed the records. But they can still be interesting to track. You can still see who owned or see what that person owned across the years. So in addition to City of Boston tax records, we also have some early tax records for towns and cities that are now part of Boston before they were annexed. So Boston itself originally was just what we would consider Boston proper or downtown. Brighton, Roxbury, West Roxbury, Hyde Park, Jamaica Plain, Dorchester, they were all individual towns and cities that were annexed between 1868, and Hyde Park was the last one in 1912. So some of those records have also been transferred to us. So if you know that your ancestor lived in one of those surrounding towns, we also have some of those records. All right, so next I'm going to talk about voter records. We have lists of both naturalized and native-born voter registrations starting in 1857. As you can see on the slide here, we have got a variety of indexes and registers for both men and women. And these are another really great genealogy resource because, again, they contain a lot of detailed information. They include place of birth, date and place of naturalization, height, weight, and occupation. And for the women, they often include their closest male relative. So here is an example of some of the men's naturalized voter registers. And you can see, like I said, it includes the date, also the ward and precinct, and their name and their signature because they had to sign the register, and where they were living, and their place of birth, and their job, and their place of business, and their date of naturalization, and the location or court. So that, to me, is also one of the most helpful bits, the court, because you can then use that to potentially go and look for the court records of naturalization, because all naturalizations were filed with the court. So, for example, this one says Circuit Court, Boston. So what you would do there for 1895 is you would actually reach out to the Supreme Judicial Court Archives, because the Supreme Judicial Court Archives collects court records from across the state, so it's possible that they might still have those naturalization records there, which I think is really cool. I also have an example of the women's voter registers, which are also pretty detailed, like I said. And these are fascinating to me as well because they include so much information, and I find it a little humorous, a little interesting that they would often record the closest male relative instead of occupation. So it could be a brother, could be a father, could be a husband, it just depends. And these records begin in 1884, which might make you a little confused because women couldn't vote nationally until 1920. But that's because in Boston, women were actually allowed to vote for school committee beginning in 1884.
Only for school committee?
Yes, only for, as far as I know, only for school committee before 1920. And then after the passage of the 19th Amendment, there was an initial push of like masses of women registering to vote, which is primarily what we have tons of voter registers starting in 1920 of all of these women who suddenly could vote, and they all registered all at once throughout the city. And then after that initial push, they used those same volumes to also register men. So in the records that we have after 1920, they have both men and women in them. All right. So next we have tons of records from a variety of different city-run institutions. The city ran houses for the poor. They ran correctional institutions and hospitals. Like I have on the list here, we have the Alms House, which was for poor, both men and women. There's the House of Corrections, which was a correctional facility. The House of Industry as well was a correctional facility. The Marcellus Street Home was a home for women and children. We have children's institutions, the Lunatic Hospital, which is an unfortunate name for a hospital that was run by the city. The temporary home for women. Yes. Yeah. The temporary home for women and children, and Long Island Hospital, which Long Island Hospital started out as a regular kind of teaching hospital, but it became towards the end of its lifespan as a chronic illness hospital. So there was a lot of tuberculosis patients that were there. And we do have also some, as well as administrative records, we also have some patient records from Long Island Hospital. Although they were unfortunately sampled before they were sent to us, which means that only a small subset of the records were actually kept, and that happened well before we existed. We're not sure why they did it, but unfortunately they did. So if you know that someone you're researching was there, we may not have their record, but that doesn't mean that they weren't there. And these can be, again, another really great resource because they often include personal information about people. We get a lot of requests for people looking for House of Industry, House of Corrections, because it was published a lot in the Boston Globe. Just a few weeks ago, I had someone who was looking for their relative because they found just a little like blotter in the Boston Globe. It was like 2 sentences that said that person was sentenced in 1935, and that was all the information that they had. So we can look in the indexes, which this is an example of, to see if we can find them. For the House of Corrections, we have both indexes and registers. And as you can see, it again provides a lot of information. You've got the court from where they were sentenced, their inmate number, their name, the date that they were committed, what their offense was, how long their sentence was, how many times that they've been committed here, and their former number, when they were discharged, and how they were discharged, which is a really, it's just a plethora of information. And for the particular person that I was helping last week, we found that she only knew about one instance that the person she was looking for was there. But because they keep track of the former numbers and how many times they were committed, we were able to find that person was in and out of this facility 5 or 6 times over the course of 10 years, which she had no idea about. So it was another kind of avenue or breadcrumb for her in doing her genealogy research.
Is that Deer Island? That was Deer Island?
Yes, this is Deer Island. The House of Corrections did move a little bit over time. Earlier it was in South Boston, and then it was moved in the mid-1800s out to Deer Island. We also, with the House of Corrections, I don't have an example of it, but we have what's called the Registers of Inmate Personal Property, which are one of the coolest, most detailed records that we have, because not only does it give their name and their signature and the dates, but it describes what they were wearing down to like the color of their pants or socks. It describes any marks on their body, be it tattoos or scars. And it's really cool to see that. And you've got eye color and hair color, and that's a really neat thing to see, dating back all the way to the 1800s. All right, so next up, we also have student records. We only have student records for some closed Boston public schools, and only Boston public schools, because we only have records created by the city government. So if your relative or you went to a private school or a parochial school or outside of the city of Boston, unfortunately, won't have those. And like I said, we only have some. Some records are also still at the Boston Public Schools Records Department. And then for schools that are still open, a lot of the time they still have them in their custody. But we have several different kinds of records. We have transcripts, which are going to be the full record with personal information and grades by year and by class. We have office record cards, which are just little postcards. and they're primarily for, you see those mostly with elementary and middle schools, and it will just have the names of the student, their birth date, their parents' names, sometimes their parents' occupation, and their address. And on the reverse, it will say like what school they went to and often what homeroom they were in. And that's really it, but that's it. It doesn't give you much detail about their career as a student.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Is this stuff digitized, these records?
The student records aren't because they often contain personal information, so we don't digitize them, and they're organized by school, not by year. So while some of them are older, over 100 years old, so they're in the public, like it's fine to share them because of how old they are. There are others that are commingled that are not. So for student records, we actually have a request form that we ask people to fill out because it gives us permission to disseminate the records if we find them. And if you are looking for records for someone who is deceased or records that you can fill out the form and just tell us in a note that the person you're looking for is no longer with us, and then we can find the records for you without needing their permission.
What about schools that no longer exist, like the Boston Teachers School or college, Boston Teachers College?
I'm not familiar with the Boston Teachers College specifically, but we do have a lot of records for schools that no longer exist. Like we have, there's Mechanic Arts, which no longer exists.
Don Bosco.
Yeah. Or I'm blanking off the top of my head, but there are.
Tech is right up
Yes,
there.
Boston Tech. Yeah, that one it also closed, I believe, in 2000 or earlier, and Boston Trade as well. Some that, or maybe either the school itself doesn't exist or the name has changed, and a lot of those records have been transferred to
That's
us.
what I was going to ask, if the name, because I think Boston Tech, the name changed to something else or
Yes.
whatever.
Yeah.
My husband went there. That's the only reason I know any of this. But so you have those records.
Yeah, we have some here, like I
Change
said.
the name, they consider it closed. Is that how it works?
Kind of, it depends. So there are some where the records would still be with whatever the school is now, and some are here. And we do have a page on our website that has a list of records location of the school name and the records location, whether they're with us or with BPS or still with the school itself. And the Boston Public Schools Records Department does have their own request form that you can go online and fill out, and they will look for records and send them to you if they find anything. Yeah.
What about the records for, it's called Boston Central Adult School, for people who got their actual diploma, but they went at nighttime?
We have some records for some evening schools. I'm not sure about that specific one off the top of my head,
I know
but
they changed the school they did it in, I think, just about every year. And that's actually how I finished my high school, my last year. And thankfully I had my diploma from it because I think like right after I did, they moved their headquarters off of Myrtle Street in Boston, and they seem to have lost all the records. And who knows if they have them or what they did with them.
so it's possible that they no longer exist. Unfortunately, we do come across that sometimes where either they weren't saved by the school before the school closed, or they were never transferred, or if they were stored somewhere in the interim before we existed. So unfortunately that does happen, but we do have, sometimes with those special programs, the records will be mixed in with the school that ran the program, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like-
it does. I was under the impression that the school committee kept them because they just, they moved it around every year or so as to what school would, high school would be that year.
Would host it. And the school, I know the only thing we have from the school committee are hearings, like hearing meeting minutes and proceedings and some school committee secretary files. So if we have for that particular school, which if you send us an email, I can definitely look for them. They'd probably be in the student records collection somewhere. But yeah, continuing on. So we also have some scholarship records. There are some earlier schools that included scholarship records. In particular, I think of Girls High School, where we also have attendance records from the late 19th century in volumes, which I think is really interesting. And then we have yearbooks, which this is an example on the slide of a Boston Technical High School yearbook from 1948. And we get a lot of people who will contact us looking to see if we have a copy of their yearbook or their parents' or grandparents' yearbook. And we do have a lot of them, but we don't have all of them, unfortunately, because again, it just depended on what the school kept at the time and what was sent to us. There are some schools that were closed after us, like Rosendale High School and Boston Trade High School, where they kept full runs of them. So we do have a really comprehensive collection of a few schools, but for the most part, they're a little bit spotty. But if you contact us looking for someone, we're happy to look. If we have the yearbook, we'll look through it and see if we can find that person and scan it for you. And I just last week, I scanned 2 different yearbooks for someone. And then once they're scanned, we'll put them up on our digital digital repository. So then they're there for anyone else who wants to see them. And then we also have student publications, which I find really fun to look at. This is an example from Rosendale High School. They called their student magazine The Tattler. And they include writing, like the cover illustration is done by students. They have a lot of short stories and poems and like school reporters, and the work is all done by students, and I just find it really fun to read. And it gives a good glimpse into what their student life was like and the things that they were interested in. But so the final genealogy record I'm going to talk about are business records. We have a large collection of these business certificate indexes from 1907 to the present. Unfortunately, we don't have the actual certificates because those aren't considered permanent records. So we only keep them for about 5 years. But these indexes give you pretty much all the same information that the actual certificate would. It gives you the owner's name and address, the business name and address, the date the business was started. And these exist for anyone running a business in the city. If the name of the business was different than their actual name, than their legal name, they had to file a business certificate. So it should be there. In modern day, you have to renew it every 5 years, I believe. But it wasn't as strict in the earlier records. So sometimes you might not be able to find someone, or you may not be able to find continuing renewals, but they can still be a really great resource for genealogy research. And because they are indexes, they're pretty easy to search. So they're done, you can find listings alphabetically both by the name of the business owner or the name of the business. And again, we get requests for these a lot too, where someone is like, I remember there used to be a furniture store or a piano store on this street or at this address, and I want to know who owned it. Or my great-grandfather owned a photography shop, and I want to see if there's a record of it. And then we can go into these records and take a look and see if we can find it. There is one caveat to this, in that if the business was filed as a corporation, they won't appear here because corporations register or file with the state as opposed to the city, and they don't do both. So a corporation, there is a state database on the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website. You can search their database to see if what you're looking for was filed as a corporation instead as a business with the city. We also have a separate collection of women's business certificates, and these are married women doing business from 1892 to 1911. They, for some reason, filed separately if it was a married woman doing business, whether her husband actually ran the business or not. And it's really valuable because it's, along with the women's voter registers, it's one of the only records we have that solely document women in the city.
Quick question, so if a woman was not married, was it just filed with the regular business records?
That I'm not 100% sure, actually. This is just what the collection is, what they were titled. And I misspoke before. So they go 1862 to 74. This particular volume was 1892 to 1911, where I got the page in the slide. But I think part of it may be that there are like tax incentives for women-run businesses, but I'm not exactly sure the reason why they were separate or if it really is just married women. But the information that it includes are the the nature of their business, the name, their name, and their husband's name, which I find interesting. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk specifically about records that we have that are digitized. We do have a lot of records that are digitized, but in the grand scheme of how many records we have at the archives, only a small amount of them are digitally available. And some are on our own website, some are with other partners. So first is tax records. So the early tax records from 1822 to 1918 are on Family Search. And you can see we did it in partnership with them before. This was done well before I came to the archives. But we had technicians from Family Search actually physically come out to the archives, and they took all the volumes that we have from this period and scanned them beautifully like this. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Family Search, but it is a genealogy website similar to Ancestry. They have a lot of records from different institutions, mainly vital records and tax records and things like this, and you can search them all on their site. Unlike Ancestry, it is free to use. You just have to sign up for an account. And as you can see here, the scan looks very much like the scan that I did in my previous example, but this one is from 1896.
Megan, are those searchable?
Yes, that is my next slide. So these are text searchable, and they have a specific search tool that you can use to search them. And I've included the URL there. And it works just like the search on their main page. If you search on their main page, you will also get tax records, but this is specifically just for this collection, and you can do it by name, which is much easier than navigating the volumes, because they're organized by ward and by street address. So you have to know where the person, or have an idea at least, of where the person lived in order to find them. And the ward numbers changed over time. As more towns were annexed into Boston, things tended to shift around. Off the top of my head, I know that it changed in 1865, 1874, 1895, 1904 or 5, 1914, 1924. So it can be a little bit confusing to figure out what ward someone was in with it changing so often. And each ward has multiple volumes because there were so many people in each ward. So you also, even if you know where they were, you often have to look through multiple volumes of records to find them. So searching them by name I find to be a lot easier. You can also, though, on Family Search, if you don't necessarily have a name or you have an address instead, you can also browse the full volumes that are available and look through all of the scanned pages. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Mary Eliza Project. This was a project done in collaboration with Simmons University, and we transcribed all of the women's voter registers. So there are more than 50,000 women who registered to vote in the months after the passage of the 19th Amendment, and they're all recorded in those volumes. And so it was partially grant funded, and it was partially funded by Simmons, and we had grad students there working on it. And we would scan the volumes, and they would go on and transcribe them and put them all in this really robust database. And it worked. We did this starting in 2021, and they finished it last year. So I believe they're all done, and it's a really great resource to go on and search them, and they're much more easy to read, and you don't have to handle the registers are really huge volumes, so you don't have to come in and try to maneuver those. And if you go to the link here, we can read a blog post that my predecessor did about the project. That was one of the last things she did before she left the archives, was working on this project, and it's a really amazing accomplishment. And then I have an example of what the spreadsheet looks like. This is available it's called Analyze Boston, which is an open data set. All of the different departments in the city sometimes publish data sets, more recent tax records, building plans and building permits and things like that. And this is where this data set lives. And it has all the information that are in the volumes, the date of registering, what ward and precinct they were in, their name, where they were living, their age, and where they were born, and everything like that. And it often will again include their recent male relative, their most closest male relative. And these, again, I just think are one of the most robust resources we have for genealogy, specifically for women, because between this and the married women doing business, they're the only two collections we have that really specifically focus on women in the city. And we also have found several pretty famous women's suffrage movement leaders in these records. For example, the project is named after Mary Elizabeth Mahoney, who is a pioneering African-American nurse and civil rights activist. Yes, yeah. It's hard to see in the example I have, but it's just an Excel spreadsheet, and they're all in there by name and by address and where they lived, and there's a search function for it too, where if you have a particular person you're looking for, you can search by name, or if you have a particular address, you want to see if there were any women that lived there that registered to vote, you can search that way too. Okay, so the last digitized resource I'm going to talk about are oral histories. We have two different collections of oral histories. The first is called the We Are Boston Records, which was a project done under the authority of the Arts Commission in Boston. And the full title was We Are Boston, Stories of Hope and Struggle and Resilience. And it was created by the 2018 artist in residence named Daniel Johnson. The project documents the history of 14 Bostonians, ranging in age from 58 to 85, many of whom volunteered their stories for the project while attending one of the artist's Memory Cafe events. So at the time in 2018, the artist set up these little cafes in libraries and other places where people could come in and sit with them and interview each other and have it be recorded and just talk about their lives and their experiences living in Boston. And it focused a lot on aging in Boston and how the city changed over time and what they saw for the future of the city. They compiled 51 different stories through this process, and it toured Boston in a 1930s era style like phone booth exhibit, which I think is really fun, where you could go and sit in the phone booth and like dial in. There were numbers for all the stories, and you could like dial in and hold a receiver and listen to what the person had to say. I think that's a really fun idea. So I highlighted one person named Dorothea Keeling, who was a community activist and longtime Boston resident. She was an educator and a counselor, and then, like I said, a community activist. And I'm going to play a little clip where she talks about participating in a sit-in and really kind of getting the bug for community activism. Yeah. Just gonna navigate to the little clip. It's close enough.
Is asking for any funny stories, memories, or characters from your life that you'd like to tell.
Staying on the theme of giving back to the community, there was a time in which we had this issue with Egan at the counters, and I was a high school student, and I had joined the NAACP. And so the NAACP wanted a close report for the people down south that were sitting and demonstrating. So I sat in on the demonstrations at the Woolworths downtown Lynn at the counter, and I picketed with a handful of other youngsters in the community at Woolworths, and I could see right then and there that if you put the time in, you could bring about change. So once again, my mother was the influence. And then I personally got involved, and so it was from that point in my life that I felt that I had some type of a purpose, and the purpose was to reach out to people who were maligned and who were thought of being less than and were disposed of on the throwaway. And I didn't feel that at that time, that just because you were a different color, that it was something different, that you didn't deserve to sit in a restaurant and eat if you had the money to do so. So I just thought that that was a terrible thing. And so it was then that I put on my advocacy hat and began to show up and do these things that bring about some change. And I was able to see the change, which gave me hope.
So, at the time when she was telling that story, she was actually living in Lynn, not Boston. But she was, after that, after going to school, she moved to Boston and was a really active community activist in the city. So we have, like I said, there are 14 different interviewees that we have recordings for from that project, and they range from community activists to performers. And it's a really great, I think it's a really great resource to learn about what it was like living in Boston at the time that they were young and what their hopes were going forward. So the second oral history collection we have comes from the Boston 200 records. So in the lead up to the bicentennial celebration of the country in 1976, the city created a corporation called the Boston 200 Corporation, and their charge was to plan and organize citywide celebrations, which they did. They planned a lot of events and exhibits throughout the city that took place between 74 and 76. And one of those things that they did was create a series of neighborhood history books. They're these small paperback books that talk about the history of each individual neighborhood within the city. And to help do that, they interviewed a lot of people, of residents, some older, some younger, about what it was like living in the city, growing up or moving to, and what their experience was and how the neighborhoods have changed over time. And they used quotes from these interviews to flesh out these pamphlets that they made. And these are really cool. We have both transcripts and recordings for these records. Not for all of them. Some we just have a recording, some we just have a transcript, and then there are some, like the one I'm gonna play, that we have both the transcript and the recording. And for the We Are Boston records as well, we have both full transcripts and recordings for all of them. So this is I'm gonna play a short clip of a Charlestown resident named Joe Lyons, who talks very briefly about his memory of the Boston police strike in 1919 when he was a small child.
How about World War I? Do you remember anything about that, the police strike?
I remember the police strike, because I was only 14 when in 1906 I was born. World War I was started in 1917 we got in, I was 11 years old at the time. So I can't remember too much about the war.
Do you remember anything about the police strike?
I remember the police strike all right. I know I was going to the store for Mother to get some bread and milk. And this big militia, about 6 foot 6, he told me to get home. I said, I'm on my way home. He said, well, you better hurry up. They called out the state militia. After 24 hours, the streets were on. There was not a lot of looting and noise, and people were getting hurt. In town, every shoe store and jewelry store, there were all the windows and everything was smashed. Mass Avenue and Tremont Street, it was a disgrace. Well, it wasn't too bad in Charleston because the militia kept everybody off the streets. After 24 hours, Coolidge was our governor then, and he waited 24 hours before he called the militia out. So you can imagine what happened in 24 hours. Oh, let me see. It started in 1919 and it started around, December I think it was 1919. I'm not too sure of the date. But it lasted, it was quite a while because I remember some of the people the boys coming back from the service, they joined the police force. And the old timers never went back. Very few of them stayed. One man that I know of, Martin Allen, he only had 6 months to go to retire and he went on strike.
So yeah, that's that. We have I should know the full number, but it varies by neighborhood. some neighborhoods like Charlestown and West Roxbury, we have over a dozen interviews just for that one neighborhood. Others like Chinatown and Hyde Park, we only have a couple, but we have probably about 30 or 40 of these interviews in total. And I think, again, they're just really cool to listen to people talk about what their life was like living in the city at various times. There's one from West Roxbury where the person talks about his father working in the ice trade and how difficult it was to haul these big pieces of ice along dirt roads at the time, because it was so agrarian originally in the city in West Roxbury that none of the roads were paved. And it's just kind of interesting to learn about things that don't exist today. So the final digitized resource we have that I was going to talk about today are photographs. We have a wide variety of photographs across multiple collections at the archives. Those include Landmarks Commission photographs. The Landmarks Commission is in charge of doing research for the National Register of Historic Places, as well as the local Boston landmark status. And they've taken a lot of photos throughout the city. We have transit department photographs, which existed before what is now the MBTA, as well as Elevated Rail, which was the company that ran all of the elevated rail throughout the city, and they eventually became the MBTA. And so those include work on like the original subway lines and things like that, and there's a lot of construction. There's Public Works Department, which again shows a lot of construction projects, but you get photographs of people just living their lives, and other buildings and things in the background, which can be an interesting and a good resource to see, even if it's not necessarily why the photo was taken. We also have some Boston Redevelopment Authority photographs, and the Boston Redevelopment Authority became the Boston Planning and Development Authority, which is now the planning department in the city. It's gone through a couple iterations, but they were in charge of all of the urban renewal projects that took place in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and they took a lot of photographs of those projects, and as well as the properties like before the work started and after, and that kind of thing. And then we also have a very large amount of photos throughout the mayoral collections. In the Mayor Collins, which are ones that I digitally processed when I first started at the archives, there's over 2,000 of them, and he was only mayor from 1960 to 1968. And it's any event he attended, there's photos of it. So you can imagine how many different things that was. Or anytime there were visitors to his office at City Hall, they took photos of it. And we also there's photos of Mayor White and Mayor Flynn, who were directly after Collins, as well as Mayor Menino, who was mayor from 1993 all the way to 2000, into the 2000s. A lot of his photographs are digital, and also Mayor Walsh more recently. We have over 2 terabytes of photos just from Mayor Walsh. We're not keeping all of them because a lot of them are like, you'll have one event and there'll be like 100 photos just from one reception, and a lot of them are duplicates. So we're still going through the process of weeding those out and deciding what's going to be kept and what's not going to be kept. But it gives you an idea of just the sheer volume of them that we have. And they can be great resources for different city employees or people who you may be researching. The Landmarks Commission photos are great for different properties. For example, the one I have up there is that's actually from Public Works Department, but you can see it's just a building that is on Boylston Street. But I'm pretty sure that structure is still there today, so it's kind of cool to see what it looked like in the past. And while we don't have photographs for every single address in the city, we do have tons of them. So it's possible that we have a photo of your house or your ancestor's house if they lived there. And these on our Flickr page, they're all up there and they're searchable. All the ones that are digitized are on our Flickr page and in our digital repository, which I will show in a minute. You can search them, and I would recommend if you're searching for a particular address, just to search by the street name. A lot of the time, the actual building number may not be identified. So, or even if there could be a picture of the house you're looking for adjacent to the one that's the focus of the photo. So I would start by searching the street name, and that will show you everything that's on that street. We also have a lot of the neighborhood photographs separated out into albums. On our Flickr page, you can see that here a little bit, where you've got Mayor White Collection, and then you have Landmarks Commission for the Central Business District and East Boston, and further down for Chinatown. So that could be another way where if you are interested in a particular area of the city, you can go on and look at just those photographs. On our digital repository, which we use Preservica for our digital repository, you can see that too, where when we catalog the digital photos, we use these neighborhood history, neighborhood tags. They're called TGN geography tags, and so it automatically lumps them into these digital collections by neighborhood. So you can go on and, like I said, just look at the photos from a particular area in the city. And this is on our repository too. Any records that we scan for patrons or for digital collections projects, we ingest into Preservica and make them publicly available here. So you can browse by collection, or you can do subject searching as well. So now I'm just going to move on to doing some remote research in the city. This is our main catalog website where you can search all of our finding aids and collection descriptions. We use ArchiveSpace to run it, and it's just archives.boston.gov. You can search by subject. You can limit to different types of records. You can search by, if you know the browse collections, or if you know the collection title that you're interested in, and it will give you a description of the collection and everything that's in it. It also notes if there are digital records available for that collection. You'll see when you look at it, it'll tell you that, and there'll be links to it where you can go and look at the things that are digitized. And this, again, is our digital repository. This is what the home screen looks like, where you can browse our full digitized collections and search for particular subjects that you're interested in. And then lastly, I'm just going to talk about some additional city records that are available digitally that aren't necessarily with us. So again, Family Search has the tax records. They also have a lot of early Massachusetts vital records. They go all the way back to the 17th century, and they're digitized, and you can search them. And they come from different sources, some from local libraries, some from the Boston Public Library, some from the state. And it's a really great resource, and it's kind of all combined where you can search them. We also have some early vital records, the physical volumes of them, but we haven't digitized those, so it's easier to start at Family Search first for those early records, and then if you can't find anything, you can come to us and we can look and see if it's in what we have, if the person you're looking for is also in what we have. Also, the Boston Public Library has a lot of digitized city records. First, they have what's called lists of residents, which were an annually published volume of all of the adults living in the city. It's kind of like a city census almost. And those are organized by ward and by precinct, but they're also text searchable. So you can see they have them from 1909 to 1910, and you can just go in and see all of the volumes that are available. Not quite all of them are available digitally, but they also have them on microfilm. So I believe if there's a year here that's not available that you want to look at, you could go to the BPL and look at them on microfilm. I'm going to try to click on one, but I know they're on the Internet Archive, which I know has been down recently. Yeah.
We get stuff there too.
So this may not work, but yeah. But you can see there's a picture there of the cover for the 1910 Ward 7, so you can kind of see what they look like. And they
also have it on Digital Commonwealth?
I don't believe these are on Digital Commonwealth. Don't quote me on that. It's possible they are.
Because I know a lot of things are done both places.
Yeah, I've never used them via Digital Commonwealth, but you could try it for sure. But then the Boston Public Library also has a large collection of city departmental annual reports and records, which I can also link to. Again, they're hosted on archives.org, so I can't click on any of them specifically, but you can see the records they have. So these are published records and annual reports. So they've got city council records, city documents, which are a compilation of annual reports by year, and they start in 1834. So these will have indexes, and you can go and look at them and see, like, the Health and Hospitals Department, the mayor's annual address, the Finance Commission, the Collecting Commission, all those annual reports that they put out every year will all be compiled into these volumes by year, which are really interesting to read sometimes. There's also some school records, some election department records. They do have a few police department records here, but not very many. And they're mostly from the Board of Police, which is like the oversight body for the police department, not actual like police officer employment records. And then there's also, the BPL also has some historic atlases that they have digitized, and you can view them. You can view a list of them from the map center at the library. There's also Atlas Scope. Are you familiar with the tool?
Is that one that does layers of different?
Yes, Atlas Scope, and the URL for that is just atlasscope.org. They've digitized a lot. Since they've digitized all of those historic atlases, you can search for an address and overlay. You can look at what it looks like now, and then you can overlay all of the historical maps that they have for that address. So you can do a direct comparison to what the layout of the area looked like now versus in the past. And those maps the atlases were created as fire insurance maps. So they list the owner of a property. They also will show usually based on the color that it's illustrated, whether it's a public building or a private building. And it also shows you the valuation on there because they were, like I said, they were made for fire insurance. I think they're really cool because you can see physically how the shape of buildings changed over time and the layouts of the departments and everything, or of the streets, I should say, and everything. So yeah, that is my presentation. I've also put our contact information up there. We have that email address, archives@boston.gov, is our reference inbox. So you can email us there if you have questions about our records, if you want to make an appointment, or if you want to look at specific things. We're also happy to speak to you over the phone, and you can always stop in by appointment. We're open Monday through Friday from 9:30 to 4:30. And we'd love to hear from you and to help you research on our records.